He saved her from a storm expecting nothing in return, but the first words she spoke beneath his roof made him question everything he knew about loneliness. "You need a woman like me." Caleb Mercer had been called many things during his 36 years beneath the western sun. Stubborn, quiet, difficult, a man who cared more for his horses than for other people. The men in Dry Creek often joked that his ranch would probably outlive him because neither one had seen much kindness in years. Caleb never argued with them. A lonely man learns that silence is easier than explaining old wounds. His ranch sat nearly 15 miles outside town, surrounded by dry grass, old cottonwood trees, and land that had once belonged to his father. The fences leaned with age. The barn door creaked every time the desert wind pushed against it. Inside the small wooden house, only one chair remained in good condition. The other had been broken for years and never repaired. The fireplace was cold more nights than it was warm, and the only voice Caleb usually heard was his own when he spoke to his horse before sunrise. Then came the sandstorm that changed the direction of his life. The desert could look peaceful one minute and become merciless the next. That afternoon, the sky turned the color of old copper as powerful winds carried walls of red dust across the empty land. Caleb was riding home after buying supplies in town when he noticed a figure collapsed near a cluster of rocks almost half a mile away. Most men would have kept riding. The storm was approaching quickly, and every second spent outside meant greater danger. But Caleb Mercer had never been most men. He covered his face with his bandana, guided his horse through the blowing sand, and found a woman lying beside a small leather bag decorated with traditional Apache patterns. Her long black hair was covered in desert dust, and a turquoise pendant rested against her chest. She was alive, but exhausted from fighting the storm alone. Without asking her name or where she came from, Caleb carefully placed her on his horse and brought her back to the ranch before nightfall. The storm roared outside his windows for hours while he prepared warm water and a simple meal. He gave her his own bed and spent the night sitting near the cold fireplace with a blanket over his shoulders. When morning arrived, the storm was gone, leaving behind a clear blue sky and a world washed clean by the desert wind. The woman opened her eyes slowly and studied the unfamiliar room around her. Her dark eyes moved across the cracked walls, the dusty shelves, the broken chair, and the empty spaces where a family should have been. Caleb stood near the doorway, keeping his distance. "You are awake," he said. "You can leave whenever you are strong enough." The woman looked back at him. There was no fear in her expression, no weakness, only the quiet confidence of someone who had survived many difficult seasons. "My name is Nayeli Redwillow," she said. Caleb tipped his hat politely. "Caleb Mercer." She continued looking around the house, and a small expression of disappointment crossed her face. Caleb noticed it immediately. "If you are about to thank me," he said, "you do not have to." Nayeli shook her head slowly. Her eyes returned to the broken chair beside the cold fireplace. Then she looked directly at the lonely cowboy who had saved her life and said words that felt sharper than any insult he had ever heard. "No, Caleb Mercer. I was going to tell you something else." She paused as the morning sunlight entered through the old windows. "You need a woman like me." Caleb Mercer stared at Nayeli Redwillow for several seconds without saying a single word. Throughout his life, many people had judged his ranch. The men in Dry Creek called it a forgotten patch of land. The women who passed through town whispered that no family would ever grow inside a house, where even the fireplace seemed to have given up. But never before had a stranger walked into his home after he had saved her life and spoken those words as if she understood every empty corner of it. "That is a strange way to thank someone," Caleb finally said, his voice carrying the cold edge of a man who had spent years protecting himself from disappointment. Nayeli did not look offended. Instead, she walked toward the broken chair beside the fireplace and gently touched the worn wood with her fingers. "In my tribe, when someone saves your life, a simple thank you is not enough," she said. "A person must return balance to what has been given." Caleb folded his arms. "And you believe repairing my house will repay a debt?" A faint smile appeared on her face. "No, your house is not what needs repairing." The answer irritated him more than he wanted to admit. This Apache woman had spent less than one morning beneath his roof, yet she spoke as though she had known him for years. "You know nothing about me," he replied. Nayeli turned and looked directly into his eyes. "I know enough. A man who lives alone leaves signs everywhere. Her eyes moved around the room. One chair is broken, but you never fixed it because no one has sat there since the person who once used it disappeared. The shelves have dust because you no longer expect visitors. The kitchen has only enough food for one person. And the fire dies every night because there is no one here worth staying awake with. Her words landed harder than Caleb wanted to show. The most painful truths were usually the ones spoken quietly. He reached for his hat hanging near the door. You have recovered enough. I will take you back to your people before sunset. Nayeli lowered her eyes for a moment, understanding that she had touched a wound he was not ready to reveal. I will leave when you ask, she said softly, but I will not leave a debt unpaid. Before Caleb could argue, she picked up a bucket and walked outside toward the old water well. The rest of the day became a battle neither of them expected. Every time Caleb repaired a fence, he returned to find another small change. The dusty windows were cleaned. The kitchen shelves were organized. Fresh herbs gathered from the nearby hills were placed beside the stove. The empty house slowly began showing signs that another human being had walked through it. By evening, the smell of a warm meal filled the cabin for the first time in many months. Caleb sat at the table, uncomfortable with a feeling he could not name. It was not anger. It was not gratitude. It was the frightening realization that the silence he had protected for so long was beginning to disappear. He looked across the table at Nayeli as she calmly prepared the simple dinner she had made from his supplies. You act like you belong here, he said. Nayeli placed the last plate on the table and met his gaze without hesitation. No, Caleb Mercer, she answered quietly. I act like this place has been waiting for someone to remember it was alive. Outside, the desert wind moved through the old cottonwood trees, carrying away years of loneliness from a ranch that neither of them realized had already begun to change. 3 days passed, yet Nayeli Red Willow showed no sign of leaving Caleb Mercer's ranch. She never asked for permission to stay, and she never spoke as if the place belonged to her. She simply woke before the sunrise, stepped into the cold morning air, and treated every broken piece of the ranch as though it deserved another chance. The old garden behind the house, which had been nothing more than dry soil for years, now carried small signs of life. The horses were brushed more carefully than Caleb had ever bothered to do himself. The kitchen no longer smelled like old wood and forgotten meals, but carried the fresh scent of herbs and bread. The changes were small, but together they created something Caleb had not felt since his parents were alive. A home. That realization frightened him more than any storm he had ever ridden through. On the 4th morning, Caleb rode into Dry Creek to sell supplies and buy animal feed. He hoped a few hours away from the ranch would clear his thoughts. Instead, the town gave him another problem waiting at the saloon door. Several ranchers stopped their conversation when they saw him approaching. Their eyes did not carry surprise. They carried amusement. Well, look who finally remembered where the town is, one man said with a grin. Tell us, Caleb, how is your new Apache housekeeper doing? The other men laughed. Caleb placed his feed order on the counter without responding. Years ago, their words would have started an argument. But loneliness had taught him that people who enjoyed mocking others were often fighting emptiness inside themselves. Unfortunately, their jokes continued. Careful, Caleb. Soon she will have your ranch, your horses, and maybe even your old chair. The room became quiet after those words because everyone knew the chair they mentioned. It had belonged to Caleb's mother, and after she passed away, he had never allowed anyone to repair it. The laughter faded when Caleb slowly turned around. That chair has been broken for 10 years, he said calmly. And somehow she was the first person who cared enough to notice. No one had an answer. For the first time, the men who had spent years calling Caleb strange began to wonder whether the stranger was not the Apache woman, but the way they had ignored a lonely man living among them. When Caleb returned home near sunset, he expected to find Nayeli preparing another meal or organizing another forgotten corner of the house. Instead, the ranch was completely silent. The absence of her footsteps felt heavier than all the years he had spent alone. He walked inside and noticed something that made him stop. The broken chair beside the fireplace was gone. His heart immediately filled with anger and confusion. He stepped outside and searched behind the barn, where he found Nayeli sitting beneath the old cottonwood tree with the chair beside her. Pieces of wood, simple tools, and carefully chosen materials rested on the ground around her. I told you not to touch things you do not understand, Caleb said, his voice sharper than he intended. Nayeli looked up at him without fear. Her eyes were calm like the desert after a storm. Then tell me what I do not understand, Caleb Mercer, she replied. The evening wind moved through the trees as the cowboy realized he had spent years protecting a broken chair because it was easier than facing the memory attached to it. And for the first time, he understood that the Apache woman was not trying to change his past. She was trying to help him carry it. Caleb Mercer stood beneath the old cottonwood tree as the evening light faded across his land. For a long moment, neither he nor Nayeli Red Willow spoke. The repaired pieces of his mother's chair rested between them like the remains of a conversation he had avoided for 10 years. The desert had taught him how to survive droughts, storms, and endless lonely winters, but it had never taught him what to do when someone looked directly at his pain and refused to walk away. That chair belonged to my mother, Caleb finally said, his voice lower than before. Nayeli placed her hands gently on the old wood and listened. She did not interrupt because she understood that some memories were like wild horses. They could not be forced to come closer. They had to approach on their own. Every evening she sat there by the fire, Caleb continued. She would mend clothes, tell stories, and remind my father that a house was not measured by its walls, but by the people who waited inside it. His eyes remained on the chair instead of on Nayeli. After she died, I could not repair it. If I fixed it, it felt like I was admitting she was never coming back. The wind moved softly through the branches above them, carrying the scent of dry earth and the distant sound of horses settling into the night. Nayeli looked at the broken chair and then at the lonely man who had spent years guarding a wound that no one else had noticed. In my people's traditions, she said quietly, we do not leave the belongings of those we love to disappear with time. We care for them because their memory deserves to continue walking beside us. Caleb looked at her for the first time since his anger had disappeared. There was no judgment in her eyes, no pity, only understanding. That frightened him even more than her honesty. How do you always know what to say? He asked. A small, sad smile appeared on her face. Because I also carry things I cannot let go of. For the first time, she reached beneath her clothing and removed a small leather pouch tied around her neck. Inside was a small feather and a piece of carved stone that had belonged to her grandmother, the woman who had taught her how to heal with plants and listen to the stories hidden in the land. After she passed away, I carried this every day because I was afraid I would forget her voice. Caleb carefully looked at the objects without touching them. He understood the feeling completely. Two people from different worlds had discovered they had been carrying the same loneliness in different ways. The next morning, Caleb did something he had not done since his mother's final winter. He sat beside Nayeli under the sunlight and helped her repair the old chair with his own hands. As they worked together, they discovered a small carving hidden beneath the seat, a symbol his father had made many years earlier. It was a tiny mark showing the location of a spring that once provided water to the ranch before it mysteriously disappeared. Caleb's expression changed immediately. His father had spent his final years searching for that lost water source, believing the future of the ranch depended on finding it again. Nayeli traced the old symbol with her fingers, her eyes filled with curiosity. Your father was trying to tell you something, she whispered. Caleb looked across his dry fields stretching for hundreds of acres beneath the endless sky. The chair he had refused to repair for a decade had just revealed the first secret that could save everything he had left. And somewhere beyond the distant hills, there were men who had already begun waiting for his land to fail. The discovery beneath the old chair changed everything. For the first time in many years, Caleb Mercer no longer looked across his dry land and saw a slow ending. He saw a message left behind by a father who had never stopped believing that his son could bring the ranch back to life. The small carved symbol became more valuable than any piece of gold because it carried not only the location of a lost spring, but the final hope of a man who had understood the land better than anyone else. For the next several days, Caleb and Nayeli searched the property together. They followed old markings on forgotten fence posts, studied the direction of the hills, and examined the places where certain desert plants still grew greener than the surrounding fields. Nayeli's knowledge of nature allowed her to notice details Caleb had ignored his entire life. Water always leaves a memory, she told him as she touched the roots of a small cluster of healthy plants growing where the soil should have been completely dry. Caleb looked at her with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. How did I spend 30 years on this land and never see what you see? Nayeli smiled gently. Because you were looking at what the land had become. I was looking at what it remembered. Those words remained in Caleb's mind long after the sun disappeared behind the mountains. However, not everyone was happy to see the ranch showing signs of life again. A few miles away in Dry Creek, Gideon Pike sat inside his large office, staring at the reports brought by his workers. For years, he had quietly waited for Caleb's ranch to fail. The dry fields, the empty house, and the lonely cowboy had convinced him that eventually Caleb would have no choice but to sell the property for a small amount. The land surrounding the ranch held more value than most people realized, and Gideon intended to own every acre. When he heard that an Apache woman was helping Caleb restore the ranch, he laughed at first. To him, it sounded like a desperate story from a man who had finally run out of luck. But when he learned that the old well area had been uncovered and signs of underground water were appearing, his expression changed completely. The following afternoon, a polished carriage arrived outside Caleb's ranch, looking completely out of place among the dusty fields and weathered buildings. Gideon Pike stepped down wearing expensive clothing untouched by years of hard labor. His eyes moved from the repaired fence to the cleaned house, and finally to Nayeli standing beside Caleb near the old well. Interesting changes, Gideon said with a smile that never reached his eyes. I leave this place alone for a few weeks, and suddenly the dead ranch begins to breathe again. Caleb stood calmly beside Nayeli. This land was never dead. Gideon looked toward Nayeli with obvious curiosity. It appears your Apache guest has been teaching you new ways to see your own property. The disrespect hidden behind his polite words did not go unnoticed. Caleb answered before Nayeli needed to speak. She has done more for this ranch in a few days than many people have done in a lifetime. Gideon remained silent for a moment, surprised that the lonely cowboy he once knew was no longer standing alone. Then he removed a folded document from his coat. I came with one final offer. Sell me your ranch today, and you can walk away comfortably. Caleb did not even look at the paper. The old version of himself might have considered it. A man surrounded by silence often believes he has nothing left to protect. But now the house carried warmth, the chair had been repaired, and a forgotten spring had begun calling him home again. No, Caleb said simply. The desert wind passed between the three of them as Gideon slowly folded the document and looked toward the hills. Then I hope you understand something, Mr. Mercer, he said quietly. Some men become very dangerous when they realize they cannot buy what they want. Caleb did not respond with fear. He only looked at the land his parents had left him and the woman who had reminded him how to fight for it. For the first time in many years, he was not afraid of losing his ranch. He was afraid of losing the person who had brought it back to life. The morning after Gideon Pike left the ranch, Caleb Mercer expected fear to remain in the air like dust after a long ride across the desert. Instead, he woke to the smell of fresh coffee, the sound of horses moving peacefully outside the barn, and the quiet rhythm of someone repairing what the world had forgotten. He found Nayeli Red Willow standing beside the old well at sunrise, studying the ground where the hidden spring waited beneath decades of dry soil. The golden morning light touched her face, and for a moment, Caleb realized he no longer saw her as the woman he had rescued from a storm. She had become the reason his house had a fire again, the reason his land had a future, and the reason he no longer feared the silence of his own thoughts. You are watching me again, Nayeli said without turning around. Caleb allowed himself a small smile. I am trying to understand how someone can arrive with nothing but a small bag and somehow change everything. Nayeli looked at him with the same honest eyes that had challenged him on the first morning they met. I did not change your life, Caleb Mercer. I only reminded you of the things you stopped caring for. Her words carried the same truth that had always frustrated him, because they were impossible to argue against. For the next several days, they continued restoring the old spring. They cleared the forgotten stones, followed the marks left by Caleb's father, and uncovered an old wooden cover hidden beneath layers of earth and time. When they finally reached the underground water source, a clear stream began flowing once again across the dry ground. The thirsty fields that had waited years for hope finally received their first promise of a new beginning. News traveled quickly through Dry Creek. The same townspeople who had laughed at Caleb now rode past his ranch to see the miracle with their own eyes. Some congratulated him. Others quietly admitted that they had judged both him and the Apache woman unfairly. Yet not every heart changed so easily. Gideon arrived in town carrying papers claiming that the spring belonged to a forgotten boundary agreement and that Caleb had no right to use it. He expected Caleb to become angry and make a mistake. Instead, Caleb rode into Dry Creek with Nayeli beside him and carried something far stronger than anger. He carried the old ranch records, his father's drawings, and decades of documents proving the spring had always been part of his family's land. In front of the town elders and ranchers, Gideon's expensive words slowly lost their power against the simple weight of truth. For the first time, the people of Dry Creek did not look at Nayeli as an outsider. They looked at the woman whose wisdom had saved a ranch they had already buried in their minds. When the meeting ended, Gideon left with nothing except the realization that money could purchase many things, but it could not buy a place where loyalty and love had already taken root. That evening, as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, Nayeli packed her small leather bag beside the doorway of Caleb's home. The sight stopped his heart more than Gideon's threats ever could. "The debt between us is paid," she said softly. "Your land is alive again. You no longer need a woman like me." The old Caleb would have accepted her words and watched another person disappear from his life. But the man standing inside that warm house was no longer the same lonely cowboy who had survived by pretending he needed no one. He looked at the repaired chair, the burning fire, and the second coffee cup resting on the table. Then he looked at the woman who had brought them all back to life and realized the hardest battle he would ever face was not fighting for his ranch. It was finding the courage to ask her to stay. Caleb Mercer stood in the doorway as the evening sun painted long shadows across the wooden floor of the house that no longer felt empty. For several moments, he said nothing. That had always been his way. When life became difficult, he chose silence. When his mother died, he chose silence. When the ranch began falling apart around him, he chose silence. And when the woman who had brought warmth back into his world prepared to leave, his first instinct was to remain silent again. But some moments in a man's life arrive only once, and even the desert wind cannot carry them back. Nayeli Red Willow lifted her leather bag and walked toward the door. She moved with the same dignity she had carried from the day Caleb found her beneath the storm. She had entered his life without asking for permission, repaired everything he believed was beyond saving, and now she intended to leave without asking him to choose her. That was what made her different from anyone he had ever known. She did not need his ranch, his land, or his gratitude. She only wanted to leave knowing that the balance between them had been restored. "Nayeli," Caleb finally said. The sound of her name in his voice stopped her footsteps. She turned slowly, waiting for the words that had taken him weeks to find. The debt was paid a long time ago. Her expression did not change, but her eyes became softer. "Then why did you allow me to stay?" Caleb looked around the room. His eyes rested on the repaired chair beside the fire, the clean shelves, and the second coffee cup that had become part of every morning. "Because every day I hoped you would find another reason." The honesty of his answer filled the room with a silence neither of them wanted to break. Nayeli lowered her eyes for a moment. "You speak as though I belong here." Caleb walked closer but kept the respectful distance that had always existed between them. He had never tried to claim her path or decide her future. "No," he said quietly. "I speak as a man who finally understands that a home is not something he owns. It is someone he chooses to welcome." The words reached a place inside Nayeli she had spent years protecting. Her grandmother had once told her that the strongest people were not those who could survive alone forever. They were the ones brave enough to accept kindness when it was offered. Yet the memories of her people, her traditions, and the life she had left behind still stood beside her like old companions. "My tribe will expect me to return," she whispered. Caleb nodded. "Then you should return." The answer surprised her. She had expected him to ask her to abandon everything she had known. Instead, he offered her the same freedom he had offered from the first day she opened her eyes in his house. "And if I never come back?" she asked. The question carried more fear than she intended to reveal. Caleb looked toward the open door where the desert stretched beneath the fading orange sky. "Then I will be grateful for every sunrise you gave this place." A single tear formed in Nayeli's eye, not from sadness, but because she had finally met a man who loved her enough not to hold her captive to his loneliness. The next morning, Before the first rays of sunlight touched the hills of Dry Creek, Nayeli mounted her horse and rode toward her people. Caleb stood beside the repaired fence and watched her disappear beyond the horizon. The ranch was alive again. The water flowed. The fields would grow. Yet as he walked back inside, the silence that once comforted him now felt different. It was no longer the silence of a man who had nothing. It was the silence of a man waiting for someone worth hearing return. The days after Nayeli Red Willow left the ranch passed slowly, like a river moving through a dry canyon. Caleb Mercer returned to his old routines before sunrise. He fed the horses, repaired fences, checked the water flowing from the restored spring, and walked across the fields that were beginning to show new life. From a distance, anyone watching would have believed the cowboy had everything he had ever wanted. The ranch was saved. The land his father had fought to protect was finally breathing again. The old house stood stronger than it had in many years. Yet every morning, Caleb still placed 2 cups on the kitchen table before realizing that only one would be touched. The second cup remained there until the coffee became cold, a silent reminder of a woman who had taught him that loneliness was not the absence of people, but the absence of someone who truly saw you. Weeks passed, and the people of Dry Creek noticed the changes in Caleb. The man who once avoided conversations now listened more carefully. He helped neighbors repair their fences and shared water from his restored spring with ranchers whose wells were running low. Some of them quietly admitted they had been wrong about Nayeli. They had judged her by her heritage before ever understanding her heart. Caleb never argued with them. He simply said that the best things that had happened to his ranch arrived in a small leather bag carried by someone they had refused to know. One evening, as the sun disappeared behind the distant mountains, Caleb sat beside the repaired chair that once belonged to his mother. The fire burned gently, and in his hands was the small leather pouch Nayeli had accidentally left behind beneath the cottonwood tree on the day she departed. Inside remained the small feather and carved stone from her grandmother. He had discovered it only after she was gone. At first, he thought about riding to her village immediately to return it, but something stopped him. He remembered the way she had looked at him before leaving. She had not looked like a woman who wanted to forget him. She looked like someone waiting to discover whether she had been missed. That night, Caleb made a decision. Before dawn, he cleaned his father's old saddle, prepared his horse, and placed the leather pouch carefully inside his coat. He did not ride to bring back a debt or ask for a promise. He rode because there were some words a man could not leave waiting. Another season. The journey across the desert took nearly 2 days, and every mile reminded him of the day he had first found Nayeli lost beneath the storm. But this time, he was not rescuing her. He was following the path she had opened inside him. When the Apache village finally appeared beyond the red cliffs, Caleb saw Nayeli standing near the entrance with her people. Her eyes widened slightly when she recognized the familiar cowboy approaching through the desert dust. She had expected many things after leaving his ranch. She expected the memories to fade. She expected the distance between their worlds to grow once more. She never expected the man who spent half his life hiding from his own feelings to ride hundreds of miles simply to stand before her again. Caleb stopped his horse and stepped down quietly. He removed the leather pouch from his coat and held it toward her. "You forgot something," he said. Nayeli looked at the pouch, then back at him, and a small knowing smile appeared on her face. "No, Caleb Mercer," she whispered softly. "I think I left it exactly where it needed to be." The desert wind moved between them, carrying the promise that neither of them had truly said goodbye. 1 year later, the people of Dry Creek often spoke about the ranch that had once been known as the loneliest place for 50 miles in every direction. They remembered the old days when the house stood quiet, the fields were dry, and a stubborn cowboy believed that surviving alone was the same as living. But the ranch they saw now was different. The old fences were strong again. The spring flowed steadily through the land. Wildflowers grew near the water where only dust had existed before. And every morning, smoke rose from the chimney long before the sun reached the distant mountains. Caleb Mercer no longer woke to an empty house. The second chair beside the fireplace was no longer a painful memory of someone he had lost. It had become a place of honor, where stories from different worlds were shared over warm coffee and quiet evenings. Nayeli Red Willow had returned to the ranch not because she owed a debt and not because she had been asked to abandon her people. She returned because she had found a place where her traditions were respected, Her wisdom was valued, and her heart was free to choose where it belonged. The small leather pouch containing her grandmother's feather and carved stone rested beside Caleb's mother's old keepsakes on a shelf near the fireplace. Two families, two histories, and two different paths now lived beneath the same roof. The people of Dry Creek slowly changed as well. The same ranchers who once laughed at the thought of an Apache woman living on Caleb's land now visited to seek her knowledge about plants, seasons, and caring for the desert soil. They discovered that understanding another person was easier than carrying years of prejudice. Even children from the town and members of Naeli's tribe played together near the spring, creating memories untouched by the fears of earlier generations. Gideon Pike eventually sold much of his property and left the region after realizing that land without respect for the people connected to it would never bring him the satisfaction he desired. The lesson he failed to understand became the lesson everyone else remembered. A place was not valuable because a person could own it. A place became valuable because someone loved it enough to protect it. On quiet evenings, Caleb and Naeli would sit beneath the old cottonwood tree where they had repaired the broken chair and discovered the message hidden by his father. Sometimes they spoke for hours. Sometimes they said nothing at all. They no longer feared silence because silence between strangers was loneliness, but silence between two people who understood each other was peace. Travelers who passed through the valley often asked Caleb what had truly saved his ranch. Some believed it was the hidden spring. Others thought it was the old records and the wisdom left by his father. Caleb would look toward Naeli as she prepared herbs in the evening sunlight, her dark hair moving gently in the desert wind, and he would smile before giving the same answer every time. The land was waiting for water, he would say, but I was waiting for someone who could teach me how to make a home. As the sun disappeared behind the western horizon and two horses stood side by side outside the old ranch house, the desert carried no memory of the lonely man who had once lived there. It only remembered a cowboy and an Apache woman who proved that the greatest things in life are not the ones we find by searching. They are the ones that arrive unexpectedly and ask us to become better than we were before.